Well, thank you all for having me in. And what I always say to Rotary groups is that you all are doing wonderful work for our community, and I sincerely appreciate it. I've got two related topics to share with you today. The first being my 2023 Columbus Economic Forecast, and the second being the labor force, which, as you'll see, is relevant to the forecast. So, next slide, please. My first topic is my 24th annual Central Ohio Economic Forecast. And I'm forecasting a net gain for the year in employment of 10,300 or 0.9%. And that brings us to 1.136 million jobs on an annual average in our 10-county metropolitan statistical area. That's the good news. The bad news is that we should get increasing employment in some months that will be partly offset by losses in employment in other months. This is one of the most, not quite yet, this is one of the most difficult forecasts that I've ever had to come up with. There's a very strong likelihood that a recession is going to break out sometime in 2023, but there's still some possibility that we'll achieve a soft landing with slower growth, but still positive growth. It's actually fairly easy to come up with an accurate forecast in the middle of a trend, assuming that you know how to forecast. It is much tougher to forecast when the trend is likely to change, as it is likely to do this year. Nobody, as I'll share in a minute, really knows when employment is going to go negative, how negative it's going to go, or even if it's going to go negative at all. So, next slide, please. Here are employment trends in the Columbus MSA, Ohio, and the U.S. beginning in February 2020, right before the pandemic broke. The MSA is in blue, Ohio's in purple, and the U.S. is in black. Now, this and the following charts are on an index basis, so they show cumulative percentage growth since the beginning point. Columbus and the U.S. have both recovered all of our pandemic losses. We did that sometime last summer. Ohio, though, was still below its February 2020 level as of December, which is the most recent number we have. Columbus employment growth had been much better than the national average, but slowed starting in the second half of 2021. The dashed line in the U.S. trend is the February consensus of economists surveyed by the National Association for Business Economics. I usually take this forecast as the jumping off point for my own forecast. This trend shows growth flattening out to nearly nothing, but not going negative. This is the average of 45 individual forecasts. Usually, working with these averages works out just fine. But in this case, there is so much uncertainty that there's a real need to look at the individual forecasts. And the pie chart that is about to come up, please, does just that. This shows the number of the 45 forecasts that are predicting quarterly employment declines by quarter. Nearly half of the economists in this survey, 21 of them, are not forecasting any negative quarters. 4 are predicting one negative quarter, but one says the second quarter, one says the third quarter, and 2 say the fourth quarter. 7 are predicting 2 negative quarters, but 2 say the middle 2 and 5 say the last 2. 10 are predicting 3 negative quarters, but 1 expects negative growth early in the year and 9 expect it later in the year. 3 of the economists predict employment declines all year, including the first quarter. But given the 815,000 jobs that the U.S. gained in January and February, that ship's probably sailed, at least for the first quarter. The most pessimistic forecast of these 45s predicts an average monthly employment decline of 354,000, a total decline of 4.2 million jobs for the year, about 2/3 of what we saw in 2009. On the other hand, the most optimistic of these 45 forecasts predicts an average monthly gain of 341,000, a total gain of 4 million, more than 2/3 of last year's 4% growth. Now, these are smart people doing these forecasts. The problem is that the impact of the Fed's monetary tightening, which is the primary driver of what we're going to see in 2023 and 2024, is unpredictable in both scale and timing. We can't tell how much tightening is not enough and how much is too much and brings on a recession. To make matters even worse, the monthly employment estimates for Columbus always come with a margin of error. And it looks to me like the estimates that we got last year were even further off than usual. I've had to adjust some of those estimates. Most of them I adjusted upward. So the monthly trend that I started my work with in 2022 may well be better than what the government reported. So you see the quandary that I'm in. I'm guessing that we got in 2022 a net gain of 2.4% year over year. The raw estimates from the federal government suggest 2.1. Be that as it may, the U.S. average was a 4% gain. As I said, my forecast is for a 0.9% gain in 2023. The average forecast from the National Association for Business Economics is 1.4. So it's pretty clear to me that we're going to get weaker growth again in 2023, weaker than average. And it's also pretty clear to me that that weaker growth is caused by workforce availability. I'll talk about that later. So the next chart shows the trend in historic and forecast annual total employment. The U.S. is in black, the Columbus MSA is in blue. The dashed blue line is Columbus growth from the government employment totals as given. If my local forecast is right, and the average NABE forecast is right, our growth advantage during the pandemic disappears this year. But as is clear, and I hope you'll agree, those are two pretty big ifs. So next slide shows construction. And construction, not surprisingly I'll bet, is likely to be our one major bright spot this year. A lot of that's driven by the Intel project. As you know, they're already moving dirt over there, and there are hundreds of construction workers on site, and that activity is already visible in the construction employment estimates that we got for the end of 2022. Intel is expecting on-site employment to top out at about 7,000 before the plants open in 2025, possibly next year. That's 15% of our region's total construction employment, and the people in that total construction employment are off doing other things, at least they are for the moment. We're expecting many workers to commute from other parts of the state and beyond the state, attracted by very high wages. Other construction workers are itinerants, traveling around the country from project to project, and some of them will land here. My forecast is for 4.8% growth in 2023 in construction, slightly more than what we got last year. Intel-related construction employment, though, is not going to disappear when the operation opens in 2025. Intel's plans, as of now, are to build 6 to 8 more fabrication plants, or fabs, over the next decade. Then there are the supplier operations. Intel wants primary suppliers close by, so the planners made great care to provide room for the suppliers on site. By the time those fabs are finished, sometime in the mid-2030s, it's going to be time to rehabilitate and retrofit the earlier fabs. My friend Mark Williams of the Columbus Dispatch tells me that there are workers in Arizona who have made Intel their entire career. Add to that all the work on infrastructure and housing for Intel workers and other population growth, and you get a pretty big bang in construction over the next few years. Next slide. Transportation has also been outperforming the national average. Columbus and Ohio employment lost less during the pandemic shutdown and snapped back immediately. It took U.S. employment 7 months to recover its losses from March and April of 2020. Columbus employment is 31% above its level in 2019. The U.S. is up less than 12%. The expectation, or the explanation, is that our transportation is much more focused on transportation of goods rather than transportation of people, which of course was a big need during the pandemic. The forecast is for 2.1% growth, or 1,900 jobs, down from 6% growth last year, which, as you can see, is less than what the government statistics suggested. Next chart. Professional and business services is our largest employment sector with more than 180,000 jobs, and is of much greater concern. Here's where I think the preliminary stats have been the furthest off. Those implied a loss of around 2,000 jobs in 2022. I'm thinking that we'll wind up with a gain of around 4,000 when we get corrected estimates, I believe, next week. But that's still less than half national average growth. There are 3 segments of professional services: professional and technical services, corporate headquarters, and administrative support and waste services. Administrative support is the big problem. It was off 700 in 2022 and should be off another 1,400 in 2023. Next chart. Another big culprit has been state government, which accounts for nearly 74,000 of our region's jobs. For decades, the state steadily concentrated its employment in Columbus. Between 1990 and 2021, state jobs in Columbus increased 17,000, while jobs statewide increased only 1,500. And that trend reversed last year. The share of state jobs here fell a bit. As a result, we were off 2.8%, worse than the 1.9% loss at the state level and the 0.8% U.S. gain. And I have us breaking even next year, but that may be, or this year, but that may be somewhat wishful thinking. Next slide. I've been arguing that a major reason for our weaker than average growth has been the labor force shortage. One argument for this is job openings, which have increased 18% over the past year. The common belief has been that lots of people who left the labor force during the pandemic can be lured back with appropriate national level policy and higher wages and benefits. They're just sitting on the sidelines waiting for the right offer to come along. Unfortunately, that belief is largely false. The pandemic just accelerated a trend that was already in place. While incentives might be helpful in individual cases, the overall growth potential of the labor force is quite limited. Here's a definition. The participation rate is the labor force, which is everybody working plus everybody actively looking for work, divided by the working age population. And the working age population is everybody 16 years and older with no upper bound. So my 93-year-old mother, who has been retired for 25 years, is in the working age population, which is a very important point. The participation rate currently at the U.S. level is 62.5% versus 63.3% just before the pandemic. And the primary driver of the drop in the labor force that we've seen since that big pandemic shutdown is and will be demographics. The U.S. working age population 55 and older has grown more than 2.7 million since February of 2020. Some of the overall decline in the participation rate is certainly due to retirements, some of which were doubtless early. Some of those folks may come back in either because they run out of money or they run out of things to do, but we certainly cannot count on that. As with so many other things, remote work, distance learning, and online ordering of food and other stuff, the pandemic just accelerated trends that were already in place. Next chart graphs the annual U.S. participation rates, believe it or not, back to 1947, together with the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections through 2030. Male participation is in purple, females in blue, total participation's in black. Male participation's been declining since the beginning of this period and probably before, as more and more men have gotten old enough and well-resourced enough to retire. Only a third of adult women were in the workforce in 1947, but women flooded the workforce in the 1950s through the 1990s. And that caused the overall participation rate to stabilize and then to increase. Women's participation topped out at about 60% in 2000. Then the impact of retirement started driving the female rate down, just as it has for men since the beginning. And you can see the impact of the pandemic, but generally participation rates now are following their long-term trend. you had a little period of stability in the mid to late 2010s, but that was an anomaly driven by the very strong economy that we had back then. Those dashed lines to the right are the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections out to 2031. So we're going to have a continued decline in the labor force participation rate, and so it's going to be harder and harder to find good talent. Honestly, this trend is not a bit of a surprise to those of us who watch these things. We were warning about this time bomb that was ticking 15 years ago, and it's finally gone off. Now, this doesn't mean that labor force is going to decline, because population both in the U.S. as a whole and in Central Ohio is increasing. Elsewhere in Ohio, not so much. But we certainly ought to expect more jobs to be replaced by technology, not as a way to make workers obsolete, but just as a way to maintain production. Next slide. Last slide. I really wish the news were better, but we might very well have a tough year ahead of us. Or we may get that soft landing and be able to breathe a sigh of relief. In any case, thanks again for having me in, and thanks for listening. So do we have time for questions? Yes.
The infrastructure bill, do you have an idea of how much of that is waste and useless stuff, and how much of it is real value that would help our economy?
The question is, how much of the infrastructure bill is waste and how much of it is real stuff? I have no idea. Waste is in the eye of the beholder. Certainly, there was this talk of a bridge to nowhere. But for those living in that community and wanting to go nowhere, it really wasn't a waste. So that is an opinion question, and I try to stay away from opinions. Yes.
I've enjoyed your forecast yearly, Peter Hare or Metropolitan Club. Have you ever done a graph to compare your forecast retroactively versus reality and how accurate you tend to be?
I usually do, honestly. And it's like I say, when I'm in the middle of a trend and forecasting, I'm within 1/10 of a percentage point, usually, 1/10 or 2/10. At a time like this forecast is going to be wrong. And I told them that in January, and I will tell you that now. If it winds up being correct, it is pure dumb luck. Simply because when you're forecasting a turn, you don't know what the turn is going to do. Yes.
And this may be something that you don't want to comment on, but do you believe that the United States is going to go to a digital dollar rather than paper money?
Possibly at some point, although it's probably no time soon. I haven't carried paper money around in probably 3 years, so I am completely digital. But I can't imagine that any time within the foreseeable future they're going to do away with paper money. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any sense of the efficiency or the likelihood of solving the employee shortage either by more immigration or by more automation?
Well, we will need both. And part of the problem in the last few years has been the shutdown of immigration, the the extreme reduction in the number of people coming in. And that, you can really see that in the Columbus MSA population estimates, which they haven't crashed, they've dropped a whole lot. We need immigrants, both for the numbers and because immigrants tend to be much more often in the working age population. Part of the challenge is ensuring that those folks coming in can integrate into the local economy, either as wage and salary workers or, as often happens, business owners, which that's a whole nother half-hour speech, but that's very, very important. Automation, no doubt about it. I'm doing a projection of insurance employment in Ohio as we speak. Well, not as we speak, but what I've shown is that there's going to be a need of more than 100,000 people to go into insurance, mostly to replace people who are retiring over the next 10 years. But automation is going to take care of a bunch of that. Again, not to make workers obsolescent, but merely to retain customers, serve customers effectively.
As an engineer, my objective was always to make as many jobs obsolescent as possible so people could fish and golf more.
Well, yeah, people can fish and golf, certainly, but they have to have the wherewithal to do fishing and golfing, and if they don't have that, then there's a challenge.
Well, that's your problem.
Okay, I'll take that on. Question. Anything else?
Question online. I wonder if we can-
Question online.
Hey, Bill, will we see a worsening in the banking crisis that started out in California?
Will we see a worsening of the banking crisis that started in California? As of now, they're saying not, because those two banks that collapsed were odd banks. Silicon Valley Bank was completely undiversified. They were completely invested in the tech sector, which, as we all know, is going through challenges right now. The other, Signature Bank, was in Bitcoin or something like that. I haven't read much about that because it only hit this morning. But the FDIC, the Treasury Department, and the Fed have stepped in and taken over. And so it looks like the depositors of those banks are going to be made whole. And that should contain the problem, although we're going to have to keep watching to see if there are any follow-on impacts. So not completely sure, but probably not. Anything else? For a
little
few.
bit? Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. So Bill is able to stay around for a few minutes, so if you didn't get to ask your question and you want to, please try to get him after the meeting. And thank you so much, Bill. We also make a donation in honor of our guest speakers, so we'll be making a donation to Freedom a la carte in your name. Thank you.